I've spent 900 plus hours over the last 5 years coaching entrepreneurs and experts, helping them grow and monetize their show. And in this video, I want to break down one of the biggest lessons that I've learned during that time working with so many different podcasters. And I want to share this lesson to really help you grow and monetize your podcast way faster. If you've been publishing valuable content for years, maybe you've had high profile guests onto your podcast, maybe you're constantly promoting, maybe you've even invested in an agency to help you create these promotional clips. If you've been doing that for years and the podcast is kind of at a plateau, at a flat line, and the numbers don't seem to budge, the show doesn't seem to gain traction, no matter what you try, the likelihood is you're making this one massive mistake, the biggest mistake that slows podcasters down from faster growth and monetization. So what exactly is this mistake? This is going to sound painfully simple to the point where when I explain what this is to you, you'll either walk away really pissed off and annoyed because it sounds so blatantly obvious, or you'll walk away with a light bulb moment and you'll see all of the dots start to connect as to why all of the efforts with your podcast hasn't resulted in the growth or ROI you've wanted. And the biggest lesson is this: most entrepreneurs and experts with podcasts struggle to grow and monetize for years because they don't know who they're talking to. They have no clarity around who their podcast is for, what exactly their podcast does for this particular person, and what massive promise their podcast is giving to that person. So again, I want to iterate, if you've been struggling to grow your podcast despite valuable content, high profile guests, promoting on social media, it's not because you're not talented enough as a podcast host, and not because you're in a very competitive or saturated space, or even because your podcast target audience are way too small. That's not the reason why the show isn't growing. Your show isn't growing because right now your show doesn't have a clear reason to exist in the minds of the listeners you're trying to reach. And if you don't have clarity on the answers to these 3 specific questions I'm about to break down, the likelihood is your podcast targeting is vague, unspecific, and it's the root cause to your podcast's current growth trajectory. So here are the 3 questions. Number 1, who is your podcast specifically for? Number 2, what specific problem are you helping that specific person solve? And then number 3, what's the specific outcome or promise your audience will walk away with after listening to your podcast? If you don't have clarity on these questions, that's okay. It's totally fine. It means that you're one step closer to growing and monetizing your podcast faster. But the other side of this is as well, if you don't have clarity on these questions, you're essentially hoping that a bunch of strangers are going to commit a massive chunk of their time, their energy into your podcast without giving them a very clear and compelling reason as to why they should listen to your show specifically. Now, this is a way bigger problem than what most podcasters realize. And I'm going to take a wild guess. You've probably heard something like this before when it comes to marketing in general. Hey, have a clear target audience, know who your target avatar is, understand who your target client is or should be. Now, here's what most podcasters don't realize. Without a defined audience, problem, and promise, every single episode that you're putting out is essentially you trying to hit the lottery, the jackpot. Now, some episodes will land for specific people, but the rest of the show will feel very generic and very broad, and it won't keep listeners coming back for more, which is the fastest way to have a podcast that gets ignored. You don't want to have a podcast that feels kind of interesting. You want listeners to discover your podcast and feel like, holy shit, this podcast was exactly made for me. This podcast is exactly what I've been looking for. And if you've been publishing valuable content for years, posting and promoting on social media, and the show hasn't started to pick up the traction you like, it's because not enough people have clarity and are getting the feeling that your podcast was exactly the thing for them. If your podcast was exact thing for more listeners, because it's clear, specific, and gives a specific promise, the show will be gaining way more traction. Way more people will be listening to the podcast, and the show will be growing month after month after month. And that's the thing. The most successful podcasters that we've worked with, the first thing that we help them do is get super clear on who their show is for. It's so fundamental. But again, it's so easy to skip over because it's the boring fundamentals that no one really likes to look at. But what we do with them, and what I'd really encourage you to do, is to get crystal clear on the positioning of your show to answer those fundamental questions. And I'll give you an example of how powerful this is. For our own podcast, it's called Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing. I know, super classy, right? But who is it for? It's specifically for entrepreneurs and experts with existing podcasts. And now, what's the specific problem we're helping people solve? We're helping entrepreneurs and experts who've been publishing valuable content for years who are stuck with slow growth. Like, that's a problem we're helping them solve. Basically, a slow growth podcast that isn't profitable. That's the problem. Now, what's the promise that we give to our audience? Well, the promise is very simple. Our promise is, hey, we're going to give you clarity around why the podcast isn't growing or monetizing as fast as you like. And we'll give you simple steps you can start taking today to grow way faster. It's a very clear, a very simple promise. And it's very easy for someone to understand what this podcast is all about. When you actually decide who the show is specifically for, every other marketing decision becomes way easier. And I mean every single marketing decision, even the ones you're probably not thinking about. For example, when you get clear on who your podcast is for, your show name should probably change. Your show description should change to speak directly to that person, their problems, and your promise. Your episode title should speak specifically to the problems that will attract that person to your podcast. Your show notes should be targeted on, again, outlining the problem you're going to solve in the episode. Your overall content strategies, the topics you decide to cover on the show, should be specifically for this one particular person. Who you decide to invite onto your podcast or reject from your podcast as a guest should be determined by, again, who the show is specifically for. The episode length should be determined by who you're targeting. Like, I'm speaking to entrepreneurs and experts. They're busy. They're not going to have time to listen to an hour-long show. But I wouldn't have come to the conclusion to have a shorter episode if I wasn't clear who my show was actually for. And then when it comes to what channels to market your podcast on, that decision's made because you know what channels your audience are likely to be on. When it comes to the actual marketing itself being way more effective, meaning when you're promoting, if you want more people to pay attention to what you have to say, to what your podcast is all about, you need to be clear on who it's for in order to attract them. But if you're not clear on who the podcast is for, then how are you going to market the show and present the show in a way to attract the right people? Again, these are the boring fundamentals that so many podcasters skip over, but it makes such a big difference. Now, I want to give you a different example to show you how a podcast that's clear on who it's speaking to will always grow way faster compared to a podcast that isn't clear on who the listeners are they're trying to reach. Let's say you have a podcast that's a vague positioning all about, I help people become more productive. You're essentially competing against thousands of other shows about productivity, time management, and efficiency. That's a lot of podcasts you're competing against. Not to talk about the fact that it's very broad, very generic. So it's even hard for you to stand out in that space. Now imagine instead you have a specific podcast that does this. It helps stressed out mums stop feeling overwhelmed by using time management tactics so they can be more present with their kids. Now, all of a sudden, your audience know whether or not the show is specifically for them. They know the specific problem you're going to help them solve, and they are attracted and they desire the outcome your podcast promises, which is for them to be less stressed, less overwhelmed, so they can be more present with their kids. Now, I want to just show you how changing this targeting ever so slightly changed the podcast entirely. If we went from helping single stressed out mums stop feeling overwhelmed using time management strategies so they can generate more profits in their business, that's a completely different show. And that's going to attract a completely different type of audience. It's so subtle, yet it makes such a drastic difference. And that's why you shouldn't skip over like the tiny details, because those tiny details really matter a lot. A mum who's feeling stressed out, single, overwhelmed, that wants a productivity podcast so they can be more present with their kids is very different to one who's looking for these time management strategies so they can generate more profits in their business. Very, very, very different types of avatars. And it's funny, we actually had a client who had a podcast similar to this. Her podcast was titled The Overwhelmed Working Woman. When she started working with us, she was stuck at around 1,500 monthly downloads. And we helped her grow her show to over 5,000 monthly downloads. And because her podcast was clear and specific, it meant she was attracting way more of the right listeners. She had a back-end coaching program and she was able to turn her listeners into clients, and she made $30,000 in profit from her show whilst working with us. This wouldn't have been possible if we didn't get crystal clear on exactly who her show was for, and then presented the podcast in a far more attractive way with a very clear promise. And that's my encouragement to you. If you've been podcasting for years and you've been stuck with slow and steady podcast growth, and you're unclear on who your podcast is for, what specific problem you're helping them solve, and the specific promise you're giving through your show, just start by answering those questions. And I promise you, you'll see your show start to move in the right direction. You'll attract way more opportunities your way. You'll have so much more fun knowing the show you're working hard on, that you've been consistent on, that you're publishing valuable content on, is reaching more of the right listeners, and the show is finally gaining traction. Look, I made this YouTube video to help you gain clarity around why your podcast isn't growing or monetizing as fast as you like. So if you like this, click the like button. If you have any questions, leave a comment down below, and be sure to subscribe if you want more of these types of videos. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.